Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at TreadAthletics.com, and today I want to expand upon a thread that I put on Twitter about a week ago talking about this concept of mechanical anchors. So I want to explain exactly what a mechanical anchor is and how I kind of came to this conclusion and kind of put this label in this framework of thinking about maintaining mechanical improvements into place. So first I want to kind of take you through my thought process, how I came up with this idea, give you a definition of it, give you some examples, and then as a player or as a coach, give you some practical implementation advice as well for how you can apply this framework of thinking into not only creating mechanical improvements, but also sustaining those and regaining lost patterns as well. So the issue with changing mechanics, right? We know that pitching development is complex and multifactorial. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of interactions going on when you think about your mobility, interacting with your mechanical patterns, with bad habits you maybe have had since you're 10 or 12 years old, with maybe strength issues or mobility issues or previous injuries at certain levels of your body. There's a lot of things going on when it comes to pitching mechanics and pitching development in general. That being said, if you followed this channel for any length of time, you understand that my view on the development process is that it's very much a trial and error process. It comes down to testing a lot of different stuff, seeing what works. And so that comes to drills, cues, strength routine, nutrition routine, mobility routine. And our job as coaches is to try to consolidate that trial and error process as much as possible. Try to give athletes some guardrails so that they're not going down these crazy paths and avoid them making unnecessary mistakes that we've seen or made in the past, having worked with thousands of athletes and made a bunch of mistakes. So that's our role as coaches, is give them guardrails through this trial and error process. So as they're bouncing around through it, we're at least telling them what not to do and hopefully pointing them in the direction of things that will work. That being said, some athletes, as you kind of go through this trial and error process, you'll have an unlock. And that's the goal, right? That's the goal, is you have some sort of major unlock where specifically in relation to their pitching mechanics, they see a big improvement, their pattern improves, their velocity improves. A lot of times this happens overnight. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer when that pattern does ultimately click. But then what you see as a coach is you see some of these athletes actually regress and lose that pattern. So they'll gain 3 or 4 miles an hour, it'll click, and then a month later or over the course of the season, that pattern starts to regress and their velocity starts to regress and they begin to kind of lose what you worked so hard to create. So how do you prevent this from happening? And how do we cement mechanical improvements once they've actually been made? And that's the idea of a mechanical anchor. Is it something that you make the improvement, now you can anchor that in, it holds that pattern there versus bouncing all over the place. So pattern fluctuation often stems from cue and drill fluctuation. So if we're changing the focus behind what we're doing, the cues behind how we're throwing, or we're changing the drill work that we're doing, we're changing all these variables, it's oftentimes linked to that is that your patterns are going to be fluctuating a ton too. So in order to stabilize the patterns, a lot of times you need to stabilize the signals you're giving to your body, which is the internal focus, and it's the different drill work and constraints that you're throwing on your body. So mechanical anchor, to give you my definition, is the throwing cue or drill that elicits and reinforces a significant mechanical improvement. And so the anchor part is holding that specific variable in your routine and in your program in a way that doesn't allow your patterns to drift too far away from that. It's holding that steady and not getting away from what works. So the idea of an anchor, it allows you to sustain and capture an improvement rather than these fleeting improvements that simply begin to die down over the course of the season, or you make an improvement and you just lose it. Right, some athletes can just capture it, and some it's a lot more difficult to actually hold that sustained pattern that they have been able to create. So this seems super obvious, but it's actually very common for pitchers to fall back into bad habits. Most of us watching this video have some experience with what that feels like. It's something clicks, and then you just, for whatever reason, you just can't find that pattern again. Now the anchor isn't just to maintain a pattern. It also functions as a backup tool. So once you've lost the pattern over the course of the season and you're like, what the hell do I do? I can't figure out how to get back to how I was throwing at the beginning of the season. Well, if you have a routine, a series, or a specific mechanical anchor, now that serves as kind of this reboot. You already have the formula for recreating the patterns that you already did. You've done it once before, and now that serves as your formula if you can identify what that anchor is for recreating those patterns. So it acts as kind of a reboot for your mechanics. Again, it's super obvious, just keep doing what works. right? It's super obvious conceptually, just like nutritionally, like if you want to gain weight, eat more calories. It's super obvious, but it's actually the implementation that is where it becomes more complex. And so guys do suffer with this issue all the time, where their patterns just kind of disintegrate a little bit. Just like nutritionally, guys have trouble gaining weight, even though it's super simple conceptually. So here's some reasons that pitchers fall into bad habits. Probably the biggest one is that they go unprepared in season. It doesn't mean that they didn't work hard all off season. It means their patterns go into season being relatively unprepared. And again, you can't get away from this to some extent because you only have a certain amount of time in the off season and you're not exactly sure when that mechanical unlock is going to happen. But sometimes the patterns aren't ready. Maybe there wasn't a sufficient transition phase where you had a mechanical unlock, but you didn't spend enough time in reps actually building them into game scenarios before they got in season. So the second they get in season with all these new variables and this game stress thrown at them, the pattern starts to break down. Now, natural patterns that you've been throwing with your entire career are a lot more resilient than a pattern that you just unlocked. So I wrote down 1,000 versus 100,000. If you've been throwing a certain way for 10 years and you just had a mechanical unlock or a change a month ago and you only have 1,000 reps on that pattern, that's a lot more susceptible to slipping back into your old patterns once you add in all the game stress. That's just motor learning 101. Injury or compensation around a previous injury, rather, is another common reason. Right? Guy has a knee injury or elbow surgery, whatever, and coming back, the body is subtly protecting against itself and against certain patterns, and so guys develop these bad habits. Bad coaching or changing coaching, right? So changing up the cues, the drills, the focus, the routines, coaches forcing an athlete to get away from those specific things that they know have worked for them in the past. Changing too many variables is another reason that pitchers specifically fall back into these bad habits. And again, sometimes there's just no reason whatsoever that you can put your finger on, and that's just part of baseball. But that comes back to identifying your routines and mechanical anchors so that you can use those to function as a reboot in the case that something does go awry. And this is what really the best pitchers can do, is they're so in tune with what works for them, they're so in tune with their mechanics that when something goes wrong in season, they can make that adjustment in between innings or in between starts and know exactly what they need to work on and what's gone wrong. So how do you actually find your anchor? Because this is where this is kind of the important part of the video. How do you identify it? It's obvious, the concept is super intuitive and obvious, but how do we actually identify it? So again, realize that this is a general concept and general framework for interpreting how you got to the current spot that you're in and interpreting your patterns. Your specific throwing keys or anchors are going to be specific to you. So because there's so many variables, what ends up clicking and working for a certain guy is almost certainly not going to be the same thing that ends up working and clicking for you. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be, and it should be, inherently individual. There may be a single anchor. It also could be a series. So it could be a routine or a series of 2 or 3 or 4 drills, and that sequence of drills in order is the thing that functions as the anchor. It doesn't have to just be one mental cue, one drill. It really can be anything that helps solidify your mechanics. And so understanding it can be a little bit more general. This is another important point. The results over time are what dictate your anchor or anchors. It's not consciously chosen. So if you're a 14-year-old who doesn't really know what your anchors are yet, you can't just sit down and write out a 12 drill routine and say, these are my anchors. It doesn't really work like that. It comes down to testing a bunch of stuff over time, and as you begin to filter out what works and what doesn't for you, you build this framework over time. And so your anchor or anchors are revealed to you over time by testing a bunch of stuff and seeing what works and not getting away from those couple keys that really seem to anchor your patterns, anchor your mechanics where they need to be. So again, the trial and error is what uncovers what works. Once you've identified something that works, you need to try to distill it down into the core variables that help the most. So maybe you were on a velocity building program 2 years ago, and that was when you were throwing your absolute best. But there was a bunch of stuff going on. You had a nutrition plan, you had a mobility routine, you had a whole velocity program with a progression, right? There was a different leg lift you were using. There was a lot of variables going on. So this is where it comes down to, can you sit back and identify what were the couple core principles from that time that really seemed to lend itself to the improvement the most. And so if you can figure out like, hey, we worked on separation, hip and shoulder separation, this was the drill that we did for that. You know, the nutrition aspect was super important, that's a separate topic, but like if you can figure out what worked and really distill it down to the core principles, that's when you can recreate it. And that's when you can be much more resilient to change, especially as you encounter a bunch of different coaches over the course of your career. They're all trying to say different things, they're all changing things, they're all giving you different feedback. If you have that, it's almost like nobody can change that. They can change kind of these ancillary things on the fringes, but they're not going to change and mess with the fundamental things that have worked with your mechanics and with your patterns over the course of your career. So I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is going to be myself because, again, this is how I originally came up with the concept of a mechanical anchor. I had a major unlock in my mechanics, a major increase in velo from this one specific drill and unlock, and realizing that if I just kept this one drill in, this cemented my mechanics and this helped my actual mound delivery, mound mechanics be exactly where they need to be. So for me, the mechanical flaw and tendency, I've always been a lower slot guy, a sidearm type guy. I have a tendency to fly open, get a little bit rotational, pull off, and never really created that separation because I would fly open. I never was able to keep the shoulders closed. I was never able to really unload the pelvis properly and stay in plane, staying a little bit more north to south. So I would miss side to side a bunch, I'd fly open, and the velocity just wasn't there, the separation wasn't there. So that was my natural tendency. That's where my mechanics want to go if just left unchecked. The anchor that I discovered was the roll-in drill. Now I've talked about this before. It wasn't specifically the roll-in drill, but it was a separation drill I kind of came up with that is close enough to the current roll-in drill that we're just going to call it roll-ins. And I gained 4 miles an hour from doing that drill. For me, I realized, okay, what just happened there? Well, there were certain positional checkpoints that I can associate with the roll-in that I know if I can hit those numbers, the mound velocity is going to be there. So I know if I can fully load and coil into the back leg, if I can keep the upper half fully closed, if I can get the arm on plane, right, I can feel these certain positional checkpoints internally, that if I'm hitting those checkpoints, I know that drill is going to be where it needs to be. I know if I can be 93, 95 out of a roll-in on flat ground, again, the mound velocity is going to take care of itself. And so I've kind of solidified not just a drill, but then associated with a drill, like what are the checkpoints within that drill? And I know if I hit those variables, everything else is going to fall into place within my overall patterns. So then the practical implementation, just again, take you through the sequence of like how I implemented this. Well, the initial fix, I knew I needed thousands of reps to make this feel natural. It just didn't feel natural initially. It felt really efficient, but it was something I still had to consciously think about. Was that I spent 50+% of all my throws throwing out of a roll, and that happened to be my anchor. I realized that, and so I spent a lot of reps trying to pattern that. So I would long toss out of it, I would do most of my catch play throws out of it, and so there was a ton of volume initially, but from there I had the pattern. And so I'm not saying once you find your anchor, you need to spend all your throws out of that anchor. Your anchor might be doing running pull downs, right? That's a common one where that can help guys figure something out, something clicks, and they get a velocity bump. But then they don't do pull downs for an entire year until next off season. So I'm not saying you have to only do pull downs or never do pull downs. The point is that you should keep it in there in some capacity if that happens to be the thing that created the unlock for you. And so what I realized was that, hey, if I could just keep 1 or 2 sets of roll-ins somewhere in my catch play, somewhere in my initial drill work, that was enough. That was enough to maintain the feel, enough to maintain the anchor, and I could just take that and run with it. And again, don't copy me. Like the roll-in is not a great drill for a lot of athletes. It happened to work for me for a number of specific reasons: my hip anatomy, my hip internal rotation, my ability, the fact that I was struggling with hip shoulder separation. There were a lot of reasons that happened to work for me, but don't copy me. It's for every one of me that it helps. It's entirely possible it's going to make you significantly worse. Again, I've written about that in the past as well. You need to find your mechanical anchors and figure out what works for you, and then don't get away from it once you find that. So here's another example of the concept of mechanical anchors in practice, and specifically here in relation to, using it as kind of a backup tool or a reboot for your mechanics. So this college pitcher, I've posted about him before, but we're just going to call him Pitcher A for now. His mechanical flaw, his tendencies, natural mechanics, led to his arm being slow. He was dragging his arm through ball release. He had a low elbow, poor weight shift, where he would kind of lose his torso-pelvic stack. Through trial and error, we figured out how to remedy the situation. We found a backwards training progression that seemed to work very, very well to fix most of those issues. In his case, here's an example: lasso drill, 10 toes at high effort to help turn his arm on, step backs, shuffle pull downs. We were able to transfer that to the mound. Right, we were able to go through this progression and get him from upper 80s to mid upper 90s over roughly a 6-month progression. Okay, great. This is where a lot of pitchers think, well, I've made the improvement. I'm always gonna throw this hard now forever. Right, at the time you're like, I just threw 95 last bullpen, like I can do this forever. And you don't realize that you need to be putting these anchors in place so that you don't lose the pattern. So we were able to transition the patterns to the mound, but the patterns then progressed preseason when he got away from this routine. So he went back to his school, he kind of got away from a lot of the things that he had been doing. And so as the patterns began to progress, the velocity also began to regress. So the associated anchors that we figured out along with this routine, again, velocity metrics, we realized that if he could shuffle 98 plus and if he could throw 87 plus on the 10 toes, in this particular case, that his velocity was going to be where it needed to be off the mound. Miscellaneous checkpoints, we're identifying, hey, not tipping the pelvis, and does he have a visually quick arm? So point being, once you identify the anchor, go one level deeper. What specifically about the anchor can give you, what can you identify as the checkpoints with that anchor? Right, then if you have the anchor and you have the checkpoints, you can be very, very certain, or relatively certain at least, that your actual throwing patterns are likely going to respond favorably to that. So practical implementation. So we had a significant velocity drop, 3, 4, 5 miles an hour as the patterns regressed. And he's kind of settled somewhere between where he initially started, upper 80s, and mid upper 90s when he was at his best. He kind of settled somewhere in the middle, and his patterns settled somewhere in the middle as well in season. And again, this isn't that surprising. We talked about how, especially if they only have 1,000 versus 100,000 quality reps, and in his case, it might only have been 300 or 400 quality reps off the mound. It's a lot more easy for those patterns to slip in season. And so he probably had an insufficient transition phase. In fact, I know he had an insufficient transition phase because we didn't have enough time before the season started to really solidify those patterns fully. He hadn't fully transitioned to game situation, game stress, runners on second base, being quick to the plate, hitters standing in the box, change in focus, new coaching, etc. All these variables kind of came on him at once, and he wasn't fully prepared because we had just made that full unlock and gotten him transitioned to the mound. But the silver lining is that these anchors that we've identified now function as the blueprint and the reboot and the backup to get to recreate his original transformation. So we should be able to do the exact same thing in a significantly less amount of time because we already know the flaw, we already know what worked, and we already know exactly what went wrong, so we can recreate it now a lot quicker the second time. Going into the following season, the goal will be really spend a lot more time in this transition phase and slowly adopting these different stressors in a training environment so that he's fully prepared when he actually goes in season for next year. So again, an example of kind of a learning process where just because you see a cool number in a training environment, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fully transfer in season, and it doesn't mean that the work is fully done. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to really put these anchors in place and be aware as a player or as a coach what those are, so that we're a lot less susceptible to these regressions. So to finish up, let's just kind of recap and then discuss a little bit how to apply these anchors as either a player or as a coach. So apply this conceptual framework. The first thing is identify your anchors. It's probably the most important thing, right? If I'm coaching an athlete, I can kind of identify the anchors myself because, that's something that I was intricately involved in. But if you're a college coach and the athlete's kind of coming to you and he's a freshman, you don't know that much about him. You don't necessarily know how he got to where he's at right now. If you have 2 90-mile-an-hour throwers, right, one of them might have been holding the exact same patterns his entire career. Those patterns are probably very stable. The other 90-mile-an-hour thrower might have been throwing 82 6 months ago. And so he's dealing with very fresh new patterns, and he's going to be a lot more susceptible to being screwed up if you start throwing out a ton of new stuff at him and changing what might have been routines or drills or cues or whatever that got him to that point. So understanding the history as a coach of how the player got to where they are right now is extremely important to not screw up the positive changes that they might have made. Again, once you've identified these anchors, again, as a player or as a coach in your players, you'll be less likely to change them without cause. You'll be less likely to just haphazardly go in there and begin changing and bouncing around from drill or program to program, because you understand exactly the variables that got you to where you are right now. Number 2 is be cautious messing with what works. Again, just to recap, but my point here is that the higher the level of the player, the more cautious you should be with implementing changes in a player's mechanics or in his routine. Now, you'd be shocked, but I've got pro guys that I've coached who are throwing upper 90s, and their coaches have no problem with going in and changing major things with their mechanics, even if they've had no arm issues in their entire career. They're throwing hard, great pitch metrics. I think we should really be more cautious the higher the level of the player, because you're actually more likely to screw that guy up than you are to help him. When a guy has gone through all these different levels and he's honed in at such a high level, almost any change you make at that point is going to be negative versus positive. The number of negative changes you can make versus the small number of positive changes you can make, it's extremely unbalanced at that point. So if you're dealing with a pro guy, if you're dealing with an MLB guy especially, as a coach, it's even more important to be cautious and kind of tiptoe into those mechanical changes when you are going to make them. As a player, again, avoid changing up your entire approach every time you hit a minor speed bump, a minor plateau. This is especially common with cerebral guys who, often they just get really over analytical and they think, oh, I've been stuck at X, Y, Z for, 3, 4, 5 months. I'm just going to start changing up everything. Well, that can sometimes work, but you're really gambling at that point. If you just begin throwing away the things that got you to where you are right now. If you got from 80 to 90 and you're trying to get to 95, don't just immediately discount the core things that got you from 80 to 90. Right? We can experiment with things on the fringes without changing the core of what got you there. Keeping a journal, again, can be incredibly helpful. A lot of players don't do this, but just keeping a journal of exactly what you're doing, strength, nutrition, mobility, cues, what you worked on that day, throwing wise. That's an extremely undervalued thing that a lot of players don't implement, and that we make sure our athletes do implement in their trackers. Then finally, as a coach, if you can identify each player's biggest keys or anchors and understand how they got there, you're going to be at a massive advantage, because yes, you have your own philosophy. You're going to go in there and say, I think this is probably how players should use their lower half. This is probably how the arm action should work. You're going to have your own philosophy. But if you just try to blanket apply that to everybody, it's going to help half the staff. It's probably going to hurt half the staff as well. If you understand how they got there and what each guy's individual keys are, you're a lot less likely to hurt the other half of the staff by blanket applying your overall philosophy to them. Treat mechanical changes as a collaboration or as an experiment. I can't tell you how frustrating it is as a player, especially one who actually has an understanding of how they made improvements and how they got to where they are, when a coach just kind of comes in and tries to override everything and treats it as like a teacher-student relationship. Now, maybe if they're in Little League, or a freshman in high school, that's something that's worth doing. But especially for college and pro guys, I think having some respect for the fact that a player is generally the one who knows their mechanics better than anybody. They can at least feel what's going on. And so treating that as a collaboration, treating that as suggestions and curiosity and experimenting, and see like, hey, can we test these couple of variables and let's see what works. I think treating it as collaboration versus just blanket forcing our philosophies on players as coaches is an extremely undervalued, underappreciated, and underutilized, relatively uncommon thing in the pro and college world right now. The college coaches and the pro coaches just think they know better, and they think that it's their duty to just go around and make changes. If it doesn't work, they just bench the player, they just cut the player. So I think collaboration is really the name of the game. Tiptoeing into the changes. So when you do identify a change, you and the player are on the same page. Hey, let's try this change. Let's see what happens. Let's try it in the next bullpen. Great. Tiptoe into those changes. You don't need to fully commit to making that change for the rest of your career. To test it in a bullpen, gather some objective and subjective data. Hey, what were the velos on that versus my old patterns? Hey, how did that feel? Hey, how was the command there? Gather both objective and subjective, and then if it seems to be moving in the right direction, keep working on it. But you can always revert back if it doesn't work. If you test 10 different pitch grips or 10 different drills and none of them work, no harm, no foul. You tiptoed into the change. You can always go back to what they were doing the next day or the next week. And then again, I probably don't need to say this, but the off season is the primary time to be making these changes. Again, just to reiterate that point, you'd be shocked how many coaches are trying to make major mechanical changes in season and just get shocked when the athlete can't actually exhibit those changes in game and the pattern begins to break down. There's a time and a place to make changes. So hopefully this gives you guys a little bit more of a framework as far as actually implementing the concept of mechanical anchors, both as a college coach, with your players, or if you're a player watching this, just having some appreciation for what allowed you to get to this point and what maybe you shouldn't be changing as much as you continue trying to move upwards and make further improvements. Guys, thanks for watching this video. If you found it useful, go ahead and gently tap that thumbs up button. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button as well. Our goal here with this channel is to put out the absolute best pitching related content on YouTube. So if you appreciate that, go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video.